Greetings and various assorted salutations. This is a lecture for the start of a new unit, an era of change. The first part we will be looking at is a continuation of the Cold War and the Vietnam War. Essentially, rolling into and through the 1960s, the Cold War showed no sign of slowing down or stopping. If anything, many Americans were starting to feel like America was losing the cultural, social, economic, and political struggle. We have incidents like Sputnik, the first man in space were being put in by the Soviets, and so many Americans felt that technologically America was falling behind. As reflected through the space race. With the containment theory, we have the failure to prevent the spread of communism into China, North Korea falls to communism, and the construction of the Berlin Wall solidifies the separation of East and West Germany, with East Germany being stuck in the Soviet bloc in 1961. But as pictured here. Additionally, the civil rights movement was a bit of an existential crisis. American democracy was plagued with things like racism. Peaceful protests were met with violence in places like Selma. And it was kind of a problem because, the freest country in the world, America supposedly, didn't necessarily feel the most stable with race riots. Granted, people often overlooked the Soviet Union's solutions with gulags. But American media was free and open to publicize everything, and they voiced a frustration with the development of things. President Eisenhower left with many feeling that while he led America to victory in World War II, he hadn't really successfully contained the communist expansion. Our new president, President John F. Kennedy, was hopeful and represented a new, younger American energy. He was the first president born in the 20th century. He's one of the youngest politicians to climb to such a high office and take the country by storm. In his youthful energy, he kind of called for Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And Kennedy vowed to be more aggressive in pursuing containment policy and vowed to offer support to any nation who called for help against the communists in the Cold War struggle. Kennedy and his foreign policy experts used what was called the flexible response, which calls for the containment of communism through the uses of all kinds of different resources. Some of these are things like expanding U.S. Special Forces as a method of proactively and covertly addressing the communist threat abroad. One particular example of Special Forces is they were deployed initially to Vietnam to serve as military advisors and train the South Vietnamese nationalists to combat communist rebels and the North Vietnamese. Which the use of special forces and covert operations is technically doesn't count as an act of war as long as you don't get caught in many cases for some of their other missions such as political assassinations and supporting coups. Anyways, less violent is the Kennedy administration's formation of the Peace Corps. They sought to provide education, medical support, and infrastructure projects to support what we call the Third World. Third World nations are considered developing nations. They're mostly located in Latin America and Africa. And these nations, the Third World kind of refers to, nowadays we think of it referring to economic development, but in this time period it was referred to, they're not aligned with the USSR or the US. It just so happened in many cases they often lacked the economic development and infrastructure present in North America or the rebuilt Western Europe. If you're curious, you can still join the Peace Corps. It's only gotten bigger since its formation, and I'll try and post details on that in the course materials somewhere if you're curious. Other programs, like the economic one for the Alliance of Progress, sought to kind of strengthen capitalist ties with other capitalist countries in Latin America. But this is particularly important because revolutionaries, some of them are communists and socialists, but not all of them, were often overthrowing semi-democratic countries. The reason why I use semi-democratic is it's a bit of a spectrum. There were a number of dictator states in South and Central America that were technically supported by the United States under the theory of, well, at least they're not communist. One example of this this occurring is when Fidel Castro overthrew the Batista family. And essentially Castro's actions drove a great deal of American investment and interests out of Cuba, because he had his government starting to adopt socialist policies, such as seizing private property and having the government manage profits. Very important because Cuba is very close to the United States, and we'll find out more about that soon. This was problematic for a lot of Americans, the fall of Cuba or the revolution of Cuba, depending on how you want to look at it, because various investors, like the mobs, criminal families, sugarcane plantation owners, oil companies, they didn't appreciate this seizure of private property. And there was a great deal of concern that Cuba would turn to communism and to the USSR for support, instead of going with the United States, who they had traditionally been with before. There's a number of attempts to remove Castro, as detailed in the slides. One particularly infamous and awkward example is President Kennedy authorized the disastrous CIA operation called Bay of Pigs invasion. Basically, Cuban exiles with secret CIA training and U.S. air support were to invade Cuba at this bay called the Bay of Pigs. It failed horribly. President Kennedy withheld air support, and Castro's troops quickly crushed the effort. The biggest problem for U.S. foreign relations was that the U.S. was caught red-handed in this mess, and most of the world was quite appalled that the U.S. was seeming to bully its neighbor off the coast of Florida. Very, very, very unpopular. There's some other botched operations that we'll look at. Under the Kennedy administration, there was an attempt to put nuclear weapons in Turkey. The Soviets did not appreciate this. And this will lead us to the first part of our mini-unit on the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we'll do some activities and learn more about that. Basically, I'll give you a quick summary here. The Cuban Missile Crisis is about a month-long event where the world almost ended, World War III almost broke out, and Florida would have been the first to go. But I'm going to leave it at that. We'll dive into more detail as we progress through this unit. Until later.